What's up, guys? Chris from Full Battle Jacket here, talking today about Call of Duty Black Ops 6, which launches in just 4 days from now on PC, PlayStation, and Xbox. Of course, this will be the first brand new Call of Duty title to also launch day and date on Game Pass, which leads many to speculate if the strategy will give Microsoft the shot in the arm that it needs to achieve their ambitions for the service. Which brings us to this opinion piece over on gamesindustry.biz. The headline, Black Ops 6 is make or break for the Game Pass strategy. I'll read the article and then we'll discuss. A year after buying Activision Blizzard, Microsoft finally has a Game Pass launch exclusive for Call of Duty. How this plays out will weigh heavily on its future strategy. It's just over a year since Microsoft shattered industry records with its $75 billion acquisition of Activision Blizzard, and next week that eye-wateringly expensive deal will face its most important test yet. The launch of Call of Duty Black Ops 6 will be a major data point for both Microsoft itself and external observers as they try to puzzle out the value of the deal and the kind of strategy we're likely to see from the company in the coming years. That's because Black Ops 6 will be available to Game Pass's premium tier subscribers at launch, a major coup for Game Pass, but one whose costs and benefits remain pretty much impossible to predict. It's not unfair to say that Call of Duty was the Activision IP that Microsoft was most desperate to acquire. It was this franchise that justified the extraordinary acquisition price tag to the extent that it can be justified at all. However, owning Call of Duty has actually left the company in an odd position, since it now owns a massive franchise that generates a very large slice of its revenues on PlayStation. Fears that Microsoft could make the franchise Xbox exclusive were never realistic. Even if Xbox leadership wanted to do that, slashing the revenue potential of such an expensively acquired new subsidiary would never pass muster with Microsoft's top management. Sony's big fear, and the reason it lobbied the competition authorities to block the acquisition, was a little bit more nuanced. It feared that Call of Duty would be a Game Pass exclusive as a subscription title, tilting the competitive landscape by allowing Microsoft to point out that people paying $70 for the game on PlayStation could instead be playing it for quote-unquote free on Game Pass. That's exactly what has come to pass, and now it's time to run the experiment and test the theory. The performance of this launch, and in particular the impact of that day and date availability on Game Pass has on sales on other platforms, will be watched very closely both by Microsoft itself and by its rivals. Getting to the point of being comfortable with launching Black Ops 6 day and date on Game Pass, however, has taken some strategic rearrangements on Microsoft's part, with the balancing act it's performing sometimes being quite public. It needs Call of Duty to be a big deal on Game Pass in order to grow the subscription service, which has been seen as a crucial metric of the success of its overall games business. However, it also needs Call of Duty to make a boatload of money, as it always does, since Xbox still effectively has a $75 billion IOU made out to Microsoft's coffers, and can't afford to sacrifice the earning potential of Activision's biggest IP at the altar of Xbox's long-term growth. Consequently, we've seen price increases and rebalancing for Game Pass tiers ahead of this launch. Xbox players will need to be on the most expensive $19.99 per month tier to get Call of Duty on launch day, although it's still going to be available on the PC's $11.99 tier, presumably a concession to a more price-sensitive market. Microsoft has also suspended the $1 14-day Game Pass trial it usually runs. Although this isn't a new strategy, it did the same thing before the launch of Starfield, and will presumably adopt this as a policy for major day-and-date launches in the future as well. The rebalancing act, however, was a tough call. It was unpopular with consumers, naturally enough, and arguably a risky thing to do at a point when Game Pass's growth seems to be struggling to move past the plateau stage. If Call of Duty is going to be a Game Pass title, though, the company needed to be satisfied that Game Pass would be an attractive option for fans of the franchise without risking sinking launch revenues for the game. I'm not sure that's actually a balance that can be successfully struck, and I suspect that some some internal discussions about whether Call of Duty should even appear day and date on Game Pass were pretty heated, but there wasn't really a choice here. Without the ability to leverage this IP to push Game Pass, the entire value of the Activision Blizzard acquisition to Xbox would be thrown into question. Thus, we end up with a bit of a halfway house of compromises. Black Ops 6 goes to Game Pass on day one, a coup for that service, but only the most expensive tier, and only after a price hike for the service. If many people subscribe for a month to play the game and then cancel, it'll end up being very significant loss to the game's revenues, which is no doubt significant fear for some people involved in the planning of this launch. Meanwhile, the odds are that the lion's share of sales of the game will be on PlayStation 5, revenue that will be very welcome on the bottom line of Microsoft's games business, but of which Sony will also be taking a pretty tasty slice as well. Another cost that's hard to calculate is that Black Ops 6 will presumably be launching without the marketing support and partnership revenue that the franchise traditionally received from Sony. Depending on how the Game Pass situation shakes out, how many new subscriptions this drives, and how long those new customers stay subscribed, it remains at least marginally possible that Sony ends up being the company that enjoys the most black ink on its financials from this launch, which is a bit of a bum note in what should be a triumphant moment for Microsoft. Part of the issue here is that the strategy around Activision Blizzard's content on both Xbox and Game Pass over the past year have been very slow to take shape, and quite weird in the shapes that it has eventually assumed. Browsing Game Pass today gives absolutely no hint that Microsoft spent $75 billion on buying a major publisher to bolster the service. By my count, only 3 Activision Blizzard games have made it to Game Pass. Only one of them is a Call of Duty title. I was honestly surprised to discover that Call of Duty backlog isn't up there. That feels like an incredibly low-hanging fruit with the launch of older games, even just their single-player campaigns on Game Pass being a pretty obvious way to drive interest and enthusiasm ahead of the huge event that is the Game Pass launch of Black Ops 6. Get ready for Black Ops 6 by subscribing to Game Pass and playing through the old campaigns. It is a straightforward and appealing message, and it's nothing short of weird that it didn't already happen. All of these misgivings will evaporate, of course, if Black Ops 6 really can drive a huge surge in Game Pass signups, and then maintain those subscriptions for at least a few months. If not though, if grabbing the launch day subscription availability for one of the industry's biggest franchises can't move the needle for Game Pass enough to change the sales pattern for the game at least a little, then it will bring to the foreground some questions about Game Pass's content strategy that have been getting harder and harder to ignore over the past year or two. Either way, this launch is a landmark in the grand experiment that is Microsoft's integration of Activision Blizzard and its catalog. How Black Ops 6 performs next week, and on which platforms that performance is strongest, is going to play a major part in setting the tenor for Microsoft's overall game strategy for years to come. Alright, so here's my opinion on the matter. I fully believe that Black Ops 6 will do just fine from a sales perspective. Call of Duty is one of the biggest brands in gaming, consistently topping sales charts year over year. While we could argue for or against the quality of some entries in the franchise, nobody can deny that Call of Duty is an absolute juggernaut in terms of annual sales numbers. The big question is, will Call of Duty on Game Pass lead to a surge in subscribers that choose to stay on the service rather than dipping in and then canceling in a month or two? I'm of the opinion that hardcore Call of Duty players are going to just buy the game rather than renting it on Game Pass. Which, if those sales numbers occur on Xbox's console, it'll suit Microsoft just fine. But the reality is, most full game purchases aren't going to generate on Xbox Series consoles. They will generate on PC and PlayStation, with a hefty 30% cut going to Sony and Steam. And while Microsoft will be happy for a la carte sales regardless of what platform they occur on, the fact remains that they didn't pay $75 billion for Activision Blizzard just so that they could top the charts on competing platforms. The Xbox division needs sustainable Game Pass subscription growth. Game Pass is the future of Xbox. It'll be interesting to see if Call of Duty on Game Pass does enough to shake up the industry between now and 2025. If I were Microsoft, I would do something really bold and disruptive. I would bundle 3 months of Game Pass Ultimate with every sale of the most expensive SKU of Black Ops 6, which I believe is the Vault Edition, every version, including sales of the PlayStation version, and maybe one free month of Ultimate with the purchase of the regular edition of the game. Something like that just might be a viable Trojan horse to get players on other platforms to give the service a try. Anyhow, the question's for you guys. How do you think Black Ops 6 will perform on Game Pass? Drop a comment down below in the comments section and let me know what you think. Give the video a like and share it with your friends. A link to the full article is down in the video description. I'll see you all in the next video. Peace.